So it would seem that I have all these neato features that come with this. Magical features that I can employ, like this sort of thing, or this sort of. Really sure, like, how these all work, but they sure seem pretty psychedelic to me. So I think I'll probably not feature them, simply because it's a little weird. Instead, I think I'll skip and just say, no thanks. So let's see if we can do that. No thanks. Just me. We're going through Romeo and Juliet by the master bard William Shakespeare. And in this time round, we're going to look at Act II, Scene 3. If you have your copy with you, you can read along. In this section, we meet one Friar Lawrence. And Lawrence is an interesting character. Many people have argued that Lawrence is a saint, or that he is a good counselor, or that he is honestly trying to bring these two together, but it's just not possible. They're all worthy arguments, I'm sure. But I'm going to make a slightly different argument once we're done with the reading. So we'll read first, and then I'll bring up a few things. But I'll make a slightly different argument. My argument is going to be that instead of being a good counselor and a good friend and a holy man and a saint, that Lawrence is something of an agent of chaos. He's, on the one hand, I think, an alchemist, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And on the other hand, he has a sorceress quality to him as well, and I'll explain what I mean by that as well. So here we are, and we're going to be reading through Romeo and Juliet. This is Act 2, Scene 3. If you have your copy, you can read along. If you have your fortification, please imbibe. Enter Friar Lawrence with a basket. The grey-eyed morn smiles on the frowning night, checkering the eastern clouds with streaks of light, and flecked darkness like a drunkard reels from forth day's path and Titan's fiery wheels. Now, ere the sun advances burning eye, the day to cheer and night's dank dew to dry, I must upfill this osier cage of ours with baleful weeds, precious juiced flowers. The earth, that's nature's mother, is her tomb. What is her burying grave? That is her womb. And from her womb, children of divers kind, we, sucking on her natural bosom, find many, for many virtues excellent, none but for some, and yet all different. All mickle is the powerful grace that lies in herbs, plants, stones, and their true qualities. For naught so vile that on the earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give. Nor aught so good, but strained from that fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. Virtue itself turns vice, being misapplied, and vice sometimes by action dignified. Within the infant rind of this small flower, poison hath residence and medicine power. For this being smelt with that part cheers each part, being tasted slays all senses with the heart. Two such opposed kings encamp dwells herbs, grace, and rude will. And where the worser is predominant, full soon the canker death eats up that plant. Enter Romeo. Good morrow, father. Benedicite. What early tongues so sweet saluteth me? Young son that argues a distempered head, so soon to bid good morrow to thy bed. Care keeps his watch in every old man's eye, and where care lodges, sleep will never lie. And where unbruised youth with unstuffed brain doth couch his limbs, there golden sleep doth reign. Therefore thy earliness doth me assure thou art uproused by some distempeture. Or if not so, then here I hit it right, our Romeo hath not been in bed tonight. That last is true. The sweeter rest was mine. God pardon sin. Wast thou with Rosaline? With Rosaline, my ghostly father? No, I have forgot that name, and that name's woe. That's good, my son. But where hast thou been, then? I'll tell thee ere thou ask it me again. I have been feasting with mine enemy, where, on a sudden, one hath wounded me. That's by me wounded, both our remedies within thy help and holy physic lies. I bear no hatred, blessed man, for, lo, my intercession likewise steads my foe. Be plain, good son, and homely in thy drift. Riddling confession finds but riddling shrift. Then plainly know my heart's dear love is set on the fair daughter of rich Capulet. As mine on hers, so hers is set on mine. All combined save what thou must combine by holy marriage. When and where and how we met, we wooed and made exchange of vow, I'll tell thee as we pass. But this I pray, that thou consent to marry us today. Holy St. Francis, what a change is here! It's Rosaline! But that is love so dear, so soon forsaken. Young men's love then lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. Jesu Maria, what a deal of brine hath washed thy sallow cheeks for Rosaline! How but salt water thrown away in waste to season love that of it doth not taste? The sun not yet thy sighs from heaven clears, thy old groans ring yet in mine ancient ears. Lo, here upon thy cheek the stain doth sit of an old tear that is not washed off yet. If e'er thou wast thyself, and these woes thine, thou and these woes were all for Rosaline. And art thou changed? Pronounce this sentence then, women may fall when there's no strength in men. Thou chidest me off for loving Rosaline. For doting, not for loving, pupil mine. And badst me bury love, not in a grave, to lay one in, another out to have. I pray thee, chide not. She whom I love now doth grace for grace and love for love allow. The other did not so. Oh, she knew well thy love did read by rote and could not spell. But come, young waverer, come, go with me, in one respect I'll thy assistant be, for this alliance may so happy prove, to turn your household's rancor to pure love. Oh, let us hence, I stand on sudden haste. Wisely and slow. They stumble that run fast. Exeunt. So, that's basically the scene. And a couple things to note just in the text itself. I was circling as we went. But in the text itself, you notice, back when Friar Lawrence is collecting his herbs and spices, where does he collect them but in an osier cage? Well, what is an osier? An osier is someone who catches birds. catches birds for food, like pheasants and things like that, but more likely catches them for entertainment, to put in cages for people to admire, for people to stuff them and put them on walls, mount them on walls, and for also tying strings onto them for little children to use. Connection, right? Because earlier Juliet has said that she wanted to have Romeo as though he were a bird and she could fling him and call him back. And here we have Friar Lawrence saying, he's using an osier cage to get his herbs and spices, but he's saying how those herbs have in them these qualities of sun and moon, of day and night, of masculine and feminine, and to put them together in the right way is the job of the skilled man. So it's a reference back to this idea of nighttime and of daytime working together, but it's also a reference to the bird imagery that we saw in the last scene. Notice also at the very end, Friar Lawrence says to him, to Romeo, "Oh, she knew well thy love did read by rote and could not spell." Right? Rosalind knew that your love was by rote. Rote memory. That is, it couldn't actually spell. It couldn't actually spell things out or know the causes of things. Which is a really interesting line because it refers back to something that Juliet says when Romeo kisses her. And she says, "You kiss by the book." Right? You kiss as though this was a formula, as though you were doing this out of a manual. Right? To kiss a girl, step 1, pucker the lips, that sort of thing. And Friar Lawrence is saying a similar thing here, that your love seems to be by rote memory. It doesn't seem to be something that's original at all. And he had said earlier in the text, just a few lines before, where Romeo says, you chided me for loving Rosaline, right? And Friar Lawrence says, "No, I chided you for doting on her, not for loving her," right? For doting, not for loving, pupil mine. Basically, that you didn't love her, because love is not this passion, this drive. This passion and drive that you seem to be experiencing is something different. And if it were something different, you could say it was lust, like in Sonnet 129. So the doting is what Friar Lawrence is against, because doting on somebody or being driven by lust is like being driven by a god. It's like being driven down around by a force beyond your control. And in that instance, you have Romeo being driven by powerful gods that he only dimly understands. Very different from love, which is a much deeper sensation, a much deeper human experience. And then Romeo says, of course, and then you bid me bury it. And he said, well, you bury it, yeah, but not in a grave, right? Right? And then draw out another one immediately. That's not what I was telling you. But Romeo's very insistent. I want to be married. I want to be married even today, if possible. You can fix everything by just marrying us today, which is extremely impetuous. Remember that the sequence of the events, we started the play sometime in the afternoon with that fight scene. Romeo's still in love with Rosalind. He goes to the party that night. He meets Juliet and falls madly in love with her. This is the next morning, and he's setting up a marriage at 9 o'clock in the morning, right? Or sometime in the morning. So it's happening very, very quickly. And people have commented on this before, that the speed of this play is like very rapid. The other thing to note is that with Friar Lawrence, if you note the structure of poetry, we've got all these rhymes, these heroic couplets, they're called. And these couplets, one after the other, after the other, after the other. Even Romeo falls into making these couplets. It could be just a stylistic thing that Shakespeare was lazy and so he's just writing couplets or whatever. But if we give him the benefit of the doubt that he knows what he's doing, the couplets are frequently used as incantation or as spell. We see that with the three weird sisters and Macbeth and elsewhere. And the couplets are frequently referred to as a magical incantation, a magical spell. So his little treatise here at the beginning could be taken as though he were saying off a magical spell, or as though he were listing off a rote memory thing that he does every day, a litany of some kind. And what's that litany about? Well, the litany is about, on the one hand, the nature of the world, and how the nature of the world is a combination of two powers, a dark and a light power. How the world is constructed of two opposing kings that encamp them still in everything. And Friar Lawrence is pointing out that I go out to collect these flowers and these herbs because they contain in them the ability to do great good, but also to do great ill, do great evil. And I want to extract the good and use that and leave the evil behind. I want to use the powers of the earth in order to create serums and potions and things that can benefit people. Notice he also says that that the earth, that's nature's mother, is her tomb, nature's tomb, and from her womb, and what is her burying grave? That is her womb, and from her womb, children of diverse kind, we, sucking on her natural bosom, find. Okay, many of these virtues. So the earth is, on the one hand, a tomb, and that's obvious because when someone dies, you bury them in the earth. But also, what is her burying grave is her womb, because out of the earth in the springtime things spring up. So the earth both takes in everything and also gives forth everything, both a negative and a positive. So all of life, Friar Lawrence's litany says, all of life is this combination of positive and negative things at the same time. And that's in human beings too, that we are a composition of dark and light. We are a composition of good and evil at the same time. And there's much to that, I think. There's a great deal to say about that, and a great deal to say about Friar Lawrence as a character who's up in the morning and out collecting these herbs in order to try and create something, a serum of some kind that's good. And also about his trying to hold Romeo to account and trying to slow him down. You're just coming hot off of Rosalind and you're going right into a new romance. That's crazy, son. Don't do that. So there is a lot to be said about him in that vein. That he is he's a character who on the one hand knows the powers of the earth and tries to work with them, and that he tries to keep Romeo from this crazed passion that he's falling into again, and counsel him to go wisely and slow, because you stumble if you run fast, which is a very good phrase to use. Now, this next bit that I want to talk about Friar Lawrence is more an argument against him as a character. There are people that have argued, I've read before, that Friar Lawrence is very much at fault for what happens with Romeo and Juliet. In fact, some people have said it's all his fault. Now, I don't know if that's entirely true or entirely fair to the character. I think probably more like that Shakespeare's writing that the problem is one which is a problem of too many things coming together at once, and thus making an inevitable tragedy occur. You've got the pilgrim Romeo who's seeking desperately for meaning in the form of love. You've got Juliet who's seeking, I think, for some way to get back at her parents, and who is beautiful and young. You got the two warring families, antagonistic towards one another. You've got Friar Lawrence who wants to do good using these two conflicting elements of dark and light, Capulet and Montague, male and female, Romeo and Juliet. And all those powers seem to come together almost by accident, almost by chance. You can say that they are brought together perhaps by a providential power. They're certainly brought together by a Shakespearean power. But he does seem to be reflecting on a sort of almost an inevitable tragedy that's going to occur here. But I do want to point out that Friar Lawrence is a character who Shakespeare, I think, is basing on somebody in history, well, two somebodies in history, and that he's making him into what essentially is an alchemist. So I'm cheating here because I've got my screen over on this side, just so you know, it's not all here, unfortunately, because the old gray matter is getting a little fuzzy as I get older. But basically, there are several different commentators who said this about Lawrence, that he's an alchemist. Jonathan Hughes, for instance, in The Rise of Alchemy in the 14th century England, writes that the friar was based on a long history of knowledge of the occult among the mendicant orders, and the friars were probably among the most significant collectors of occult texts. Then there's another book called the Book of Aquarius, which is Alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone, and it states outright that Friar Lawrence is presented as somewhat of a philosopher who studies nature, but he's an alchemist, as we see from his first lines. Rebecca Owens, who is actually writing at Shakespeare's birthplacetrust.com, says that Friar Lawrence expresses beliefs about the curative powers of plants which are derived from one Philippus Paracelsus, a Swiss physician whose attendance to more esoteric practices such as alchemy and astrology led to his insistence on the importance of the spiritual aspect of effecting a cure rather than just relying on medication, however efficacious the herbal compounds were. Paracelsus lived from 1493 to 1541, so 50 years before Shakespeare was writing this play. Furthermore, Friar Lawrence is very secretive in what he does, and as Hughes writes, the term occult derived from the Latin occultus, referring to the secret supernatural or divine forces to be found in the terrestrial sphere beneath the moon. The belief in such powers was based on the notion that everything within the earth emanated from the same divine force that governed the heavens, and that nothing corporeal could ever be lost, but remained in a constant state of flux and would ultimately be restored to its original divine purity. The scientific understanding of the workings of nature was the key to the occult wisdom imparted to the late medieval art of alchemy. So remember how Friar Lawrence says everything goes into the earth and comes out of the earth. Everything is composed of dark and light powers. Well, that speaks directly to this idea that the powers are based on the notion that everything within the earth emanates from the same divine force. Followers of the occult, especially alchemists, saw that all of the created world emanated from this being itself, and the being emanates into two major powers, pling, dark and a light. And from that dark and a light power emanate all the other forms of creation, all the multifarious forms of creation. There's actually a painting by William Blake called The Ancient of Days, where he's an old man in a sphere in a sun-like circle, and he's pointing down two hands, and rays of light are coming off those two hands. And that's emblematic, for Blake at least, it's emblematic of the Ancient of Days being this power that forces everything into these two different categories, dark and light category. Which, by the way, for those of you who are interested, that's why Blake was writing his Songs of Innocence and Experience, but that's much later, a different thing entirely. The point here is that, as Hughes is pointing out, alchemists were shadowy figures on the fringes of society, no formal standing. And Friar Lawrence, he's obviously a priest. He's obviously part of an order, no doubt the Franciscans perhaps. But he's living on the outskirts of the city. He's living on the outskirts of society. And he himself is doing something which he doesn't publicly pronounce. Even though he's later praised by others as being a good and holy man, he does certain activities which other people don't know about because he's worried that he'll get found out about them. And as we see later, he's very worried that this big experiment is going to go badly and he's going to get caught. But as we look at this character, we have to recognize that King James I, who was writing himself a book on demonology in 1597, was very concerned with the occult and with witchcraft, and demonology. He was very concerned with all that. And Shakespeare included in one of his plays, Macbeth, the characters of the three witches in some ways because James himself was interested in it. So James, the whole period of time under James was one which was really kind of obsessed with this idea about witches and witchcraft and the occult. And as Hughes notes elsewhere in his book, the alchemists continued to attempt to harness the transformative powers of the sun and the moon. So we've got in the character of an alchemist, somebody who's trying to take the sun and the moon and harness those powers. Well, what is Lawrence doing? But he's taking the power of, if you will, dark and light, Romeo and Juliet, and harnessing those powers, bringing those powers together. In the terms of the story, he's trying to unite the two houses and bring peace to the city. But that's, in some ways, that's almost metaphorical for wanting to fix the world by bringing together these two convoluted powers that don't seem to fit, these two star-crossed things that don't seem to fit well. If one could bring together dark and light, if one could bring together sun and moon, if one could bring together death and life, and at the same time harness those powers and control them, then you could do miraculous things, or so the alchemist proclaimed. Now, that also refers to another character here, because there's another character in history that Shakespeare was probably thinking of, and that's Roger Bacon. And Roger Bacon was a character who is one of Europe's leading scientists. He's a Franciscan, and that's why it's possible that Friar Lawrence is to some degree based on Roger Bacon. Bacon lived in the 13th century, 1220 to 1292, and he was reputed to have had a laboratory on Folly Bridge in Oxford, there in England. He introduced the concept that alchemical medicines could preserve and extend human life. He had a vision of a universal science integrating all branches of knowledge that could lead to salvation and the prolongation of life. Okay? Now, so far, with both Bacon and with Paracelsus, it's hard to say, well, these men were wrong or they were bad or anything like that. So I'm not really putting that forward as they're wrong or they're bad. What I'm putting forward is that Shakespeare based his character of Friar Lawrence to a great degree on these historical figures and made Friar Lawrence an alchemist more than anything else. There doesn't seem to be much that one can say that's bad about wanting to prolong human life. There's not much one can say about wanting to harness the powers of nature to make a better world. Certainly, come the Enlightenment, that's exactly what those men were doing. And people like Isaac Newton, for instance, were men who were trying to harness the powers of the physical world. And look what they did. They created this box, more or less. I mean, the technology that went into creating the phone, or creating the airwaves, or creating indoor heating, or creating lighting, or clothing, or food that we now enjoy, that technology emerged from a shift in thought about the world. The shift in thought was one from the world is as it is and as it always has been, part of God's plan, and we simply have to suffer it. Shifting that to the world is a powerhouse of energy that if we tap into it, we can improve our own lives and the lives of others. That shift, which has occurred since the 1700s, has benefited millions of people, you and I included. So I'm not saying that it's wrong. That's not the point. The point is that the character is based upon these two characters of Bacon and Paracelsus. I think it's important to note that Shakespeare was aware of both of these characters, and that in England, during the reign of Henry III, the English court was becoming the focus for the study of alchemy and the occult, according to Hughes. So the English court was actually not just peripheral to alchemical attempts, but it was really becoming the center of alchemy in Europe. There's another character, A.J. Mulland, who writes in his essay, Roger Bacon as Magician. He wrote that a prose romance was written probably in the late 16th century, right, 1580s, 1590s, entitled The Famous History of Friar Bacon, containing the wonderful things that he did in his life, also the manner of his death, with the lives and death of the two conjurers, Bungay and Vandermast. Very pleasant and delightful to be read, the deeds recounted are of a type that will later be termed magical. John Bale, in his Summarium of 1548, described Bacon as, quote, a juggler and necromantic mage who was said to have performed great marvels at Oxford. So Shakespeare probably, there's no doubt that he would have known of these characters, of Bacon at least, of Roger Bacon at least, and probably of Paracelsus. And he's basing his character, Friar Lawrence, on Paracelsus and Bacon. But notice the word that he uses, a necromantic mage. That needs a little bit of definition, as does the term alchemist. What is alchemy? Alchemy is normally conceived of men who tried to turn lead into gold. Like literally lead into gold, to become wealthy from taking lead and transmuting it into gold. And they did so using this magical object called the Philosopher's Stone. And people normally saw them as developing with the Philosopher's Stone an elixir called the elixir of life. Right? So most people conceived of alchemists as literally trying to turn lead into literal gold using a magical object called the Philosopher's Stone and producing from that exchange something called the elixir of life. That actually is metaphor for what they were trying to do, because the alchemists were not trying to literally turn lead into gold. They were trying to take on the one hand, a world that was leaden, that was earth-bound, that was clay-like, and to change it into something which was beneficial to human beings. To take the elements of dark and light and combine them together and produce something great that could improve the world. And they were also trying to change the human spirit, which itself is prone to lead-like activity or lead-like existence, laziness and brutality and all, and trying to change that into a gold-like soul. So alchemists were on the one hand trying to change the world by literally change the world from a lead clod-like existence to a powers harnessed in order to make the world better. And they were also trying to change the individual souls from lead-like existence into divine gold-like existence. And by doing so, in both cases, they sought to prolong human life, and thus an elixir, right, that would prolong human life. If you could make air conditioning and better medicine and better transportation, better clothing, better food, better economy, wouldn't you have people lasting literally a lot longer in life? And I mean, look around you. The average age is now 80 or 90 years old, whereas before it was like 30 or 40 for a lot of people. So that's worked. On the other hand, if we looked at it as elixir of life, an eternal life, an eternal thought, an eternal eye-opening experience, spiritually and intellectually, that's worked too, because the leaden soul changed to a gold soul becomes much more eternal, much more aware of eternal things. So the alchemist's job was not just to become rich or to delve in petty things. It was to really change humans and change the world into something glorious and good. It's mocked frequently, like Jonathan Swift mocks the alchemists in his Gulliver's Travels. He's very funny, but he mocks them, and I think unnecessarily so. What happens, though, in history is that at some point these two camps in the alchemical movement branch off from one another. The one which is developing as creating better souls moves into a more spirituality and education, and sees that the world is not the thing to concentrate on, but individual souls are to be concentrated on. The other camp moves in the opposite direction, saying we can't improve individual souls. What we can do is we can improve the physical world, and they begin working on that model. And the one becomes the Enlightenment movement, and the other one just exists, still does. But one way or the other, alchemists were trying to change lead into gold by harnessing these two powers and using the Philosopher's Stone, the solution, whatever the magical thing was that could cause this transformation to occur. It's like that Far Sight cartoon, right, with a big equation here and a big equation here, and in the middle it says a miracle occurs. Right? That miracle is the philosopher's stone, whatever that is, that would cause that. And this way of thinking goes far, far back, all the way to Plato or before that. So Plato himself in 5th century Athens was thinking about this idea already. So this idea of the elixir vitae, Hughes writes in his text that it was a substance thought to be capable of changing base metals into gold. The same term, more fully elixir vitae, the water of life, was given to the substance that would indefinitely prolong human life, a liquid that was believed to be allied with the philosopher's stone. Okay? So Lawrence is definitely an alchemist, and he's attempting to do this thing. But I think that what we see in Shakespeare is that he's writing at the end of the Renaissance, as we mentioned earlier. And at the end of the Renaissance, because the Renaissance was full of this, we had a lot of those. Leonardo da Vinci was an alchemist, and Michelangelo was an alchemist, and Raphael was an alchemist. All those men were actually painters and sculptors, but they were also involved in what was called the great work. They were involved in this trying to transform the world. So during the Renaissance, you had an attempt to transform the world to the better using this technique. By the end of the Renaissance, when things are beginning to slide downhill and look pretty grim again, that's when Shakespeare's writing. And I think in some ways he's commenting on why this went south, why this went sour. And that raises that image of the necromancer that I just read about. Because Shakespeare seems to suggest that Lawrence is doing the second path of alchemy, which is to try and transform the world, harness the powers, transform the world itself into a better place. And I think Shakespeare may be against that. Why might he be? I would suggest that he might be against it in the same way that Mary Shelley is against it. In Frankenstein, when she writes Frankenstein, and that's in the 1800s, 1818. But the idea being that when you start to harness the world itself, you do so to some degree by denying the idea that there's a providential God who might have a plan. Now, I'm going out on a limb here, because to say this means that, we should just sit around and wait for the coronavirus to take us? No, that's not what I'm saying. Because I think finding a cure for it and finding a vaccine for it is extremely important. But to some degree, one has to take matters into one's own hands in order to find that vaccine or that cure. That's that second branch of alchemy. In some ways, you have to take matters into your own hands, because God isn't going to come down and provide you with air conditioning or with food. And so you have to do it yourself. To do that is, to some degree, to suspend the belief that we live in a providential world. And if you take it to its absolute extreme, then the horror begins, because then you have things like transferring consciousness into computers. You have the idea of re-sleeving. You have the idea of genetic engineering. You have the idea of race culture and destroying whole races. All that movement that we saw in the early part of the 20th century with the eugenics movement and the Nazis in Germany was in some ways an attempt to make the world a better place by manipulating the human person, and by destroying the bad elements and improving the good elements. And that's horrific. That horror can be in the extreme of this viewpoint. So what does one do? Does one simply say that God has a plan and no matter what happens, or does one take matters into one's own hands and try to fix the broken world? Because when we try to fix the broken world, we're in some ways working with dead matter, with clay. We are handling dead matter or clay to try and revivify it, to bring out of the tomb of the earth a new thing, a tomb womb of the earth, a new thing. And that's exactly what Friar Lawrence says he does. That the tomb of the earth is where things go in that are dead, and out of that comes, from the womb, is extracted this power that we can then manipulate and use. And I think that Lawrence takes it too far. He attempts to use at some point an elixir, and we'll see that later, an elixir of life that causes something, well, it causes a death-like experience. And his whole plan, which is very convoluted, ends up backfiring and wrecking things, causing tragedy rather than something beautiful. C.S. Lewis, the philosopher of the 20th century, wrote in The Abolition of Man about sorcery and about magic. And he wrote that Frankenstein's idea of science is a twin opposed to real alchemy and religion. Real alchemy and religion are opposed to that Frankensteinian idea of magic and sorcery. And Lewis wrote this: in the old days, wisdom, not magic or science, was the primary concern. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men, reality to the soul. The solution is a technique, and both magic and science, in the practice of this technique, are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious. It's a pretty powerful quotation. And I think Lewis hits the nail on the head here with what the problem that Friar Lawrence poses. How does he solve the constant conflict of the earth, the Montagues and Capulets? Does he take those two powers together and harness them and create something wonderful and beautiful? He tries. He certainly tries to. And in doing so, he, I think, becomes something like Victor Frankenstein. He becomes someone who tries to fix the earth. And rather than seeking wisdom, he sees an opportunity to fix the world and tries to subdue reality rather than accepting the reality or even diverting the reality. So in this play, there are a number of different possibilities. He could have told Shakespeare, or he could have told Romeo, don't go for Juliet. He could have stopped the two. He could have refused to marry them. But instead, he uses them as an experiment to see whether or not this plan of uniting two things together is at all a possibility. And in doing so, I think he creates great tragedy, and he handles the dead matter of the earth, so to speak, as a necromancer would do. Necro means dead in Greek, and mancer is that hands, the handling of the dead. So he is a handler of the dead who seeks to subdue the earth and bend it to his own notions, rather than someone who seeks wisdom and counsels self-control and discipline. And for that reason, I tend to side with the idea that Lawrence is at fault in this work. But as one last thought, Shakespeare is never cut and dry. He's never just, this is bad, this is good. Because I think he's recognizing a problem in this play. How does one fix the problem of the earth? Do you try to do something to improve the world and then it backfires? Or do you simply accept that the world is a broken place and live with the fact that there's carnage in the streets on a regular basis? Because that's a conundrum. That's a bit of a problem. And in this play, we don't see an amicable solution at all. We see rather that there's this inevitable tragedy that occurs because these forces don't easily mingle. And Friar Lawrence's attempt to mingle them only exacerbates the problem. So, that's it for today. We'll move on to the next scene tomorrow. Hopefully that's food for thought for you for now. I thank you so much for joining me. I give out a huge plug both to the Shakespeare 2020 project. If you haven't already, check that out. I encourage you strongly to do so. Ian Desher's reading of Shakespeare, throughout the year. King John is the play that's being read now, so looking forward to that. Also encourage you to check out the History of the English Language podcast, Kevin Stroud's excellent and thorough examination of why we say the things that we say. For word geeks like me, it's just a delight. And then also I encourage you to check out Ian McKellen, who continues to read sonnets, one a day. So he's now up to, I think, 5 or 6, and it's wonderful to hear his voice. I also encourage you to check out my own Patreon page. If you like what I'm doing here, then please feel free to become one of my patrons, and any amount that you can contribute would be greatly appreciated. So until we meet again, my friends, God bless. Stay safe, stay warm, stay healthy. It's very interesting times that we live in. God bless you all and keep you.